Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Justine O'Grady, and I'm the principal here at Holy Trinity. And as a school community, we're thrilled to have you here this evening on behalf of the board. So I would like to begin this evening with an opening prayer. If you could join us in the sign of our faith, in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Loving God, we thank you and we praise you for your presence deep in our hearts, for your presence here in our midst, for this opportunity to come together, to affirm your identity and to celebrate our common vision of creating safe and inclusive school communities. We thank you for the quality of achievement that is represented here, for the many diverse efforts that contribute toward the building of a better board, of better schools, and of a better world. Please refresh our spirits, confirm and strengthen our vision, sustain us and strengthen us in our daily lives. We ask this through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. At this time, I'd like to welcome Jack Negro to the podium. Jack is our new Assistant Superintendent with the Halton Catholic District School Board.
Thank you, folks. Hold your applause for a second, because I really want you to recognize the two key people that have put this evening together for you. So you've already met Justine O'Grady, the principal here at Holy Trinity, but another principal in our system, Nancy Donalfo, has also been instrumental in putting this evening together. So I'm just going to ask you to recognize their efforts, Nancy and Justine. Just one more introduction tonight. We have a trustee in the audience. I just wanted him to be recognized for his presence here tonight. It's Trustee Mark Rowe. Trustee Rowe. And so I welcome you on behalf of the chair of our board, Diane Rabenda, and our new director, Paula Dawson, to this evening with Dr. Tracy Vaillancourt. We are here because of a common purpose that we all share, and that is to ensure that your kids in our schools feel both safe, welcome, and supported. The bullying prevention and intervention plan that our board has developed has multi-targets in terms of our work, and parents are one of them, and this is part of that particular goal of bringing everyone into the discussion about bullying prevention and intervention. Just so you know, tomorrow Dr. Vaillancourt will be talking, first of all, in the morning to all our principals, and in the afternoon to a variety of school and board staff about bullying prevention and intervention. So we really want to thank you tonight for joining us to have this discussion. We know that you have busy lives. We know that there are children at home tonight doing other things, and you're here, and that you probably have 14 different things that you could be doing, but it's really important that parents are involved with us in this discussion. We know that parents are our children's first and most important teachers, and we value the partnership that our schools have with you. So at this point, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Tracy Vaillancourt, who is a Canada Research Chair in Children's Mental Health and Violence Prevention at the University of Ottawa in the Faculty of Education and the School of Psychology. She is also an adjunct professor in the Department of Psychology, Neuroscience and Behavior at McMaster University, and a core member of the Offord Centre for Child Studies. Dr. Vaillancourt's research examines the links between aggression and biopsychosocial functioning and mental health, with particular focus on bully-victim relations. Dr. Vaillancourt is currently leading a community universe research alliance on the prevention and intervention of bullying, which is funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. She is also on the Minister's Expert Panel for Safe and Accepting Schools. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Tracy Vaillancourt.
Thank you. So I'm thrilled to see so many people out, and I don't think it was because of the free Tim Hortons coffee. It would have been if there were Timbits, I would have been a little suspicious, but in any event, what's going to happen is I'm going to probably speak for about 45 minutes to an hour, and then there's going to be plenty of time to field questions. If there's a burning question in between and you don't understand something or there needs to be a point of clarification, feel free to jump up and shout it out. I absolutely don't mind being interrupted, unless it's my husband doing it. That's a whole other story. But absolutely, so just jump in. And I start with the provocative question of why should everyone be concerned about school bullying? Because my frustration, and I'm actually at a point where I'm quite frustrated. I've been studying bullying for over 15 years. I've been an advocate for people who are bullied for many, many years. And I find that people are only interested in the topic when their child is involved or when they have a bullying situation. And yet bullying is witnessed by far too many people for us to be just watching it and not doing anything. So I'm hoping that we are going to be a collection of people who stand up for people who need advocacy and not be apathetic bystanders. So that's the reason I asked the question. I absolutely think it's everybody's responsibility. My Canada Research Chair is, it's a funny title. It's in Children's Mental Health and Violence Prevention. And the two are inextricably linked. There's absolutely a firm link between mental health issues and bullying. To put it in context, 20% of children and youth in Canada have serious mental health problems and learning issues. 10% of children and youth have problems that are chronic and lead to significant impairment in school, home, and community living. The problem is only 1 in 6 of those with mental health problems receive services, and most of the services in children's mental health are not evidence-based. So I'm a child psychologist who used to do clinical work, and a lot of what we're doing is we're just hoping it's going to be right. Parents, teachers, and primary care providers often don't recognize mental health problems in children and youth. They often tend to think that they have behavioral issues when actually the behavioral issues are symptoms of a significant mental health issue. So we need to get caught up. And I know at the ministry level that there's a huge push for school-based mental health. And I know the principals are aware of this because that's where the province is going. Mental health problems account for at least 20% of the burden of physical illness and disability in adulthood. And if you look at the 10 leading causes of disability in adulthood, 7 are mental health issues. So depression and anxiety is trumping hypertension. Cardiovascular problems have now been trumped by mental health issues. Mental health issues, educational underachievement, and physical health problems tend to co-occur. And about 50% of all mental health disorders begin before the age of 15. So when we see a 12-year-old who's been diagnosed with depression, there's a good chance that that person will be in the system for a long time with mental health problems. So it's a huge issue. The thing about mental health issues is that they are caused by poor treatment by peers. So before we get there, we first need to really understand what we're talking about when we're talking about bullying. So this definition was put forward in the scientific community about 30 years ago, and most of the research is based on this idea, that a person is being bullied if he or she is exposed repeatedly and over time to negative actions on the part of one or more person. So bullying is a subcategory of aggression that's differentiated from the odd quarrel or a fight by the fact that it happens all the time, or the stress of being bullied again could be also the repetition in this equation. There's an imbalance of power, and that it's intentional. So people intentionally hurt others. The person who is bullying has more power, and that's really important. Bullying is about a systematic abuse of power. We often ask kids to stand up for themselves when they're being bullied. Trust me, if they could, they would. Nobody wants to be bullied. Absolutely, it's not a path people choose. So when we ask people who are being victimized, to advocate for themselves were actually really misguided, because it's precisely the imbalance of power that's putting them in jeopardy. The Ministry of Education has a very comprehensive definition, and I think it's actually the best definition in the world. And the reason I say it's the best definition in the world is it's well thought through. It actually has all of the yeah buts covered. So the ministry defines it as it's typically a form of repeated, persistent, and aggressive behavior. And I love that they say typically. I've consulted on numerous cases where the bullying incident was so severe that it happened once, but it was so extreme that the person was afraid to go back to school. So, you know, you can have these critical incidents be classified as bullying. And it's directed at an individual or individuals that is intended to cause or should be known to cause. So we can't have that excuse that I didn't know it would cause harm. It's intended to cause fear and distress and or harm to another person's body, feeling, self-esteem, or reputation. So this is one of the only definitions in Canada, with the exception of Manitoba, and I think British Columbia is almost on board, where they actually would include social aggression or indirect aggression. You know, the sort of aggression where you show up at school and nobody's going to talk to you. You get the 3-week silent treatment, that sort of thing. So in the past, bullying has been defined in education acts as verbal and physical, and we've ignored the fact that most of it is actually indirect or social. And bullying occurs in the context where there is real or perceived power imbalance. And this is important, especially if you're here because you want to advocate for a child. You know, a lot of times you'll talk to school board personnel and they'll say, it doesn't make sense. Like, how can your kid be bullied? He's way bigger than the other kid. And it's the perception of power imbalance. We don't live in the 10th grade, thank goodness, I'm past the 10th grade. And so we actually don't understand the dynamics, the peer group dynamics. The politics of the playground are pretty cutthroat. And so the perception that that person has more power is precisely what affords that individual the opportunity to oppress another person. So it's a very important definition, and it's part of the Education Act, which means it's law, right? So this is something that should make Ontarians proud. Unfortunately, it's not something that a lot of people know about. So we all know about it today now, right? We're good. It takes many forms, and I think the focus in the past has been on verbal and physical because it's so obvious. You get a bloody nose, you have a broken arm. It seems so extreme that it's easy to rally support. But we know that bullying takes many forms, that social or indirect or relational bullying is actually what takes place most often in the school ground. Kids spreading rumors about others. Again, peer group exclusion. You know, the infamous birthday party invitations, and you get manipulated over whether or not you're going to be invited or not. You know, just the really mean incivility that occurs that happens behind closed doors or without the privilege of the teacher knowing because it's circuitous in nature. There's also cyber, and we're seeing an increase in cyberbullying. Kids are socially connected. If they're not socially connected, they tend to also be at risk because they can't monitor their peer group. They can't keep track of who's saying what about whom and about them. Racial and sexual also are included. There's a very firm link between bullying and mental health problems. And as I said, about 20% of children in Canada are not faring well. They would meet clinical diagnostic criteria for a mental health issue. Now, what does the evidence say? Well, we know from studies that there are numerous long-term consequences. Academic difficulties, school truancy, increased absenteeism, somatic complaints. In fact, there was a meta-analysis, which is a way of collating, putting all the studies together and coming up with a summary statistic that tells you if there is an effect or not, showing that somatic complaints are found among people who are victimized, stress-related illness, physical health problems, low self-esteem, depression, social withdrawal, isolation, social anxiety, loneliness, suicide, aggressive behavior. The list is pretty long, and the list tends to be robustly replicated, so people are finding these patterns over and over again. We know from large studies, and this is just one example, that was looking at any type of bullying involvement compared to controls, so kids who have had no bullying involvement. So they weren't bullies, they weren't victims, they weren't bully victims. Sometimes kids who bully others also get bullied. And what you see if you look at the blue, red, and green lines is that these are psychiatric diagnoses among kids who have been identified as playing a role in bullying. And children who are in these roles are overly represented in mental health, with mental health diagnoses. Now, one thing that's coming out of the research is that there are these very long-term studies that are actually suggesting that if you look at kids 30 years after they've been bullied, or 30 years after they were bullies, the victims are still not faring well 30 years later, and the kicker is the bullies are doing all right. So we really need to prioritize this. There is some evidence that children who are identified in grade 9 as bullies were more likely to be convicted of a criminal offense by 24. So there's one study that showed 60% of boys who are identified in grade 9 as bullies had a criminal offense by the time they're 24. But the latest study that came out, it was just published in Psych Science, which is a really prestigious journal by Wolke and his colleagues, showed that bullies seem to do all right, but victims don't fare well even 30 years later. A recent study looking at children and their post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms, and the thing you may not know is that you cannot diagnose post-traumatic stress disorder unless the person felt that there was an imminent threat to themselves or somebody that they loved. So they had to be very afraid. They had to worry for their lives. And in this study, it's a very well conducted study. They looked at 963 kids in grade 8 and 9, and they found that for bullied students, about 28% of boys and 40% of girls met the clinical cutoff for post-traumatic stress disorder. This isn't minor stuff. You know, rape victims get diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. People who survived the Holocaust, war veterans, they get diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. And we have children who are being bullied who get diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. I used to do clinical work, as I said, and I often thought about the temporal sequence because about 95% of the kids that I saw in the clinic were being bullied. I actually just spoke to a former student of mine who's a child psychiatrist in Hamilton, and I asked her, what percentage of kids do you see who are being bullied? And she said they're all being bullied. They're coming to see her, they're not faring well, and they're being bullied. So I used to think that perhaps the temporal sequence was that kids had poor mental health, and the peer group picked up on that. So we had kids who were a little bit dysregulated in their emotion, and kids would pick up on that and then would bully them, and then that would exacerbate their mental health issues. But after becoming more on the science area, being more enriched or immersed in that research, it became apparent that that's actually not the typical pattern. So the question is here, are children and youth bullied because they're unwell to begin with, or do they become unwell as a consequence of being bullied? So what comes first? Bullied to poor mental health, or poor mental health to bullied, then further mental health issues? The research firmly supports that most kids, so most children, probably 90 to 95% of the cases, kids become unwell as a consequence of poor treatment. So they're mandated by law to attend school, right? And they come well, and their parents send them with all the hopes and aspirations that they're going to have a good life, they're going to be well educated, and they're going to be healthy, and they become unwell as a consequence of how their peers are treating them. Just a few studies if you were interested. When you look at internalizing problems such as depression and anxiety, peer victimization is strongly linked to increased internalizing problems in ensuing years, even 30 years after the fact. There was a recent meta-analysis, and if you recall, the meta-analysis puts all of the studies together to see if there really is an effect. Because you can have an effect because you had a very special population that doesn't replicate across other sites. And they asked whether or not victims of school bullying become depressed in later life, and the answer was yes. And this was the looking at the probability of being depressed up to 36 years later. And they found that was much higher among bullied children. In terms of externalizing problems, so aggression, substance abuse, delinquency, and the like, we also see that peer victimized children tend to have externalizing problems in later life. I talk about the profile being some kids get sad and some kids get mad, right? And you'll see both profiles in your office if you're a principal. Some are externalizing their frustration and others are internalizing it. And the research is pretty strong there also. Now, in terms of academic functioning, it's interesting because it's not as straightforward. So our knowledge actually is a little bit more limited, and we tend to find pathways that are either indirect or not found. We do find some work showing that victimized children fare less well academically and avoid school more over time. And we recently just published a study looking at this, and what we find is that academic functioning usually comes out later, the poor academic functioning. So typically what you'll see is peer victimization to mental health problems. The mental health problems will then be related to poor academic functioning. And a lot of times it works through absenteeism. So kids don't want to come to school if they're being bullied. If they're not at school, they're not getting the material that they need to be successful in the following unit. We know that the way a child functions in one domain has a cascading effect on the way she functions in other areas. So the research is kind of showing this over and over again, that it may not have a direct pathway from victimization to depression, but it eventually shows itself in other domains, or it'll go through an externalizing problem to an internalizing problem. And just as one example, so this is using data. I have a very large study. I've been following these kids since they were in grade 5, and they are now at the end, they're going into grade 11, and we'll follow them into adulthood. This is with the Hamilton Wentworth District School Board. And as just as one example, we found that if you're victimized in grade 6, you have poor school attendance in grade 7, and then in grade 8, your GPA gets hit. So if you're looking at a relationship, for example, between peer victimization and academic achievement in the following year or concurrently, you may not find it because the pathway is through poor school attendance first. The other thing that's interesting, and I'll say it to your administrators a little bit more tomorrow, is that we find links between poor EQAO performance in grade 3 to outcomes later on. So kids who are identified as poor writers in grade 3 are more victimized in grade 5. And that victimization then leads to more depression and things of that nature. Now, one of the questions I often get asked is, why is there so much heterogeneity in an outcome? And I find that this heterogeneity actually becomes some people's, in a sense, their call for apathy. So the reason why some people don't do anything is because they always compare the kid who is crying and is high on internalizing problems and is refusing to go to school. They'll compare that kid who's being bullied to another kid who's been bullied and seems to be faring okay. And they always will say, well, look at little Ashley. She's had a really rough go and she seems to be okay. So, obviously your little Heather is exaggerating the point. She's probably a little bit of a drama queen. And I think that is very, very difficult and it's problematic. And I think if we understand the neurobiology of peer victimization, we're going to be in a better position of understanding why it is that some kids fare better than others. The bulk of my work is understanding heterogeneity and outcome. Why is it that Ashley seems to be okay and Heather doesn't? So we know that if we look at why some do well and some don't, there are many moderators and mediators. For example, the nature of the abuse. So studies have shown that boys who are physically bullied tend to fare poorer than if they were socially bullied. Whereas girls, if they're excluded from the peer group, that's worse than being punched in the stomach. So the nature of the abuse will have an impact on where they go. Social support. I used to work as a consultant for children's, for CAS and CCAS. Some children are abused at home and they come to school and are abused by their peers. It's a double hit. Some kids get bullied and they have great support at home or great support from their hockey team. The family structure might also be the case. My dad used to hate when he would get to his new class because they would always ask him if he was Mikey's little brother, and Mikey was the biggest fighter ever. So he knew he was behind the 8 ball as soon as he started out, right? So sometimes there are reputations within families that will put people at risk. And temperament also has been shown to be related to outcome. The thing that I'm interested in is in biology. How can a person's biology confer a risk? And the thing is that we can only really study, or we observe things that are observable. So I don't know what your DNA is because it's not observable. But we do studies, and we do look at DNA, and we look at other biomarkers, and we see that the outcomes are different for a variety of reasons. First of all, I would love to eradicate the term drama queen. So if you understand the neurobiology of peer victimization, you're going to know that they're not drama queens, right? They're not exaggerating their plight. The UN report on violence against children said that there's a persistent social acceptance of some types of violence against children. Corporal punishment and other forms of cruel and degrading punishment, bullying, and sexual harassment, and a range of violent traditional practices may be perceived as normal, particularly when no lasting visible physical injury results. So basically the UN says we ignore things that are not bleeding, right? And it's true. So if their heart is bleeding, we don't pay attention to it. We need the external physical evidence. There's the old adage that sticks and stones may break our bones, but words will never hurt us. Says who? It's interesting because there's so much evidence suggesting that's not the case. And I'm going to give you an example, some neurophysiological evidence. So recently, I don't know if you remember this, this was in the newspaper about a year ago, and the person's name is Robin Tomlin. And Robin Tomlin went after the Vancouver School Board. He's dying of a liver disease. And his daughter encouraged him to remedy an issue that has been bothering him for 42 years. He was severely bullied in high school. And it culminated to the point where at the end, in the yearbook, the official typewritten descriptor, so the typewritten descriptor that is approved by the faculty, so there would be a teacher that would have overseen this, was fag. So that's his descriptor. So everybody who took home their school book, their yearbook, this is how he was described. Yes? 1970. Yeah. So can you imagine? So here are the adults in the school who are supposed to be protecting this individual have not protected him. He was humiliated. He couldn't get past it. Rightly so. He said to one reporter that he felt like emotionally they'd been beating him with a stick for 42 years. It's interesting because a lot of times people will describe their situation to me using physical pain metaphors. I felt like she punched me in the stomach when I didn't get invited to the party. You know, these sorts of things. So in any event, the school board at first was not interested in hearing because they thought he was a little rude when he approached them. And then he got a hold of the media, and now the school board's pretty responsible, and they've actually tracked down almost every yearbook and had the offensive page replaced. Okay, so they've tried to make amends. But 42 years, you know, this man has been carrying around this pain. Absolutely, the teachers would have approved the yearbook release with the descriptor fag. Absolutely. In any event, the reason I'm using Robin Tomlin's example is because there's now neuroscience that supports why he's describing it the way he is. So for example, there are several experimental studies that show that people can relive and re-experience social pain more easily than physical pain, and that the emotions they feel are more intense and painful. So if I ask you to recall a time when you were in the 5th grade and you broke your leg, you can talk about it and it won't conjure up a visceral reaction. You're not going to get emotional. You're not going to have that heavy feeling in your chest. But if I ask you about the time when everybody excluded you in the 5th grade and they called you names for that whole year, it will be as if you're living it today. So physical pain is often short-lived, whereas social pain can last a lifetime. So Winston Churchill said that criticism may not be agreeable, but it's necessary. It fulfills the same function as pain in the human body. It calls attention to an unhealthy state of things. He was right. He was absolutely right. And what's happened now is we have neuroimaging techniques. So we could put people through a scanner and we can have them recall a stressful event that was, where they were excluded, or we can have them think about an event where they broke a limb. But really what we tend to do is we have them play a game while their brain is being scanned where they think they're being included or they're being excluded. And these studies have shown that physical pain and social pain share the same neurostructures. So we have overlapping systems in our brain, and it's probably linked to our evolutionary past, whereby we needed a neural alarm to tell us if we weren't belonging. We needed to feel uncomfortable when we didn't belong because our survival would have then been in jeopardy. So it makes sense when people say, I feel like somebody punched me in the stomach when they're describing social pain. Their brain is actually processing the information like if you kick them in the shin. Think about the pain. It is the same. So in any event, so that makes sense from Tomlin's perspective. The other thing too is that there's studies showing, so for example, Mike Crowley at Yale, who's a colleague of mine, we're collaborating on a study replicating this, found that rejection is differentiated in less than 500 milliseconds by children. So their brain picks up like this, that somebody's excluding them. We are wired to belong. We're wired to see these little nuances, these little social differences that we're not belonging or we are belonging. So there's that line of evidence. So our brains we have an overlapping system for physical and social pain. But there's also a lot of evidence from the neuroendocrine area. So looking at how the body deals with stress. And what it's showing is that there's a very specific pattern of how kids who are bullied are processing stress. So we know, for example, that there's a direct link between being victimized and depressed. I already told you that, right? We also know from the research that was originally conducted by myself at McMaster and some other colleagues that's been replicated around the world, where we show that peer victimization is related to dysregulation of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. It's a fancy word, very long, to say your stress response system. The end game of your stress response system is this hormone called cortisol. When you're stressed out, your cortisol is high. Your cortisol is high in the morning. Kids who are bullied have low cortisol, and it doesn't make sense. But if you compare it to other very stressed out groups, it actually does make sense. Holocaust survivors have been shown to have very low cortisol. People who've been raped repeatedly show low cortisol patterns. Children who are maltreated by their parents show low cortisol pattern. When you look at mental health issues, people who are depressed tend to have higher cortisol than people who have post-traumatic stress disorder. Post-traumatic stress disorder is almost invariably related to low cortisol. Now, this may sound odd, but what seems to be happening is you have receptor sites in your brain that are there, that are the receptor sites for cortisol, glucocorticoid receptor sites. And after repeated exposure of high circulating cortisol, studies have shown that it leads to neural death. So the receptor sites are not working anymore. So then you have a blunted response instead of an elevated response. The point here is that we have biological measures that are telling us that kids who are bullied are as stressed out as people who have been raped, combat victims, so people who've come back from, the Gulf War or something of the like. They have similar profiles. Now, what tends to be the case with cortisol is it goes high before it goes low, because remember the receptor sites tend to be damaged over time. There's also studies that show that it's related to disruptive neurogenesis. So we published a study that looked at children's memory using very sophisticated, state-of-the-art, like the Cadillac sort of versions of memory to look at specifically where is the memory impairment of kids who are bullied. And we found that the memory impairment is in places that are rich with glucocorticoid receptor sites, so your hippocampus and your prefrontal cortex, the places that are sensitive to the effects of cortisol. So this is a paper that we published showing that. So we asked the question, why do kids who are bullied do poorly in school? Could the mechanism be that they actually have their brain is different as a function of being stressed out? Has the cortisol changed the way their memory works? And the research that we just published suggests that is the case. Now, if you look at genetic studies, what it's showing is that that there's a causal effect between adverse childhood experiences on neuroendocrine response to stress. So if you look at monozygotic twins that are discordant for being bullied, so one twin is bullied, the other isn't, they share the same genes, they typically share a very similar family background and their experiences at home, but their school experiences are different. When they look at things like that, what they find is that the kids' expression, their stress, the way they deal with stress changes because they're being bullied. So it's not the case that they have a different HPA axis and the peer group is picking up on this somehow, right? It's not the case. The case is that their stress response system is changing as a function of their stressful environment. And then finally, the genetic evidence gives good indication of why it is that some kids go left and some kids go right. Now, there was a very important paper that was published in a very good journal called Science, and it looked at the influence of a polymorphism of the serotonin gene. So serotonin is a neurotransmitter. It's implicated in mood. So if you are depressed, typically if you see a psychiatrist or a general practitioner, they may prescribe you an SSRI, so Prozac or something like that, and it increases the serotonin in your brain. That's the mechanism, and that's very crude explanation. So if you're a medical doctor and you're in the room and you're cringing, just keep in mind that we're trying to have everybody understand the mechanism. So in any event, so you have an expression of a gene, so you have the same gene that can be expressed differently, right? Some people have curly hair, some people have straight hair, right? So you can have an expression of a gene, a same gene be expressed differently. So we know with serotonin transporter gene that you can have a long allele, a short long allele, or a short allele. So the expression of the gene is based on this polymorphism. What they found was they looked at kids who were either not maltreated, probably maltreated, or severely maltreated in childhood, and what were their chances of being depressed when they were 26 years of age. And what you see is that if you have a long allele for 5-HTT, your chances of being depressed are no different than if you had been abused or not abused. So that's really interesting. So you can, beat the snot out of this kid every single day, and their chances of being depressed are no greater than the kid who was treated very well in childhood. Now, if you were treated poorly every single day and you have a short 5-HTT gene, your chances of being depressed are close to 70% by the time you're 26. So it's almost a given you're going to be depressed because of your maltreatment. So remember Ashley and Heather? So why is it that one is depressed and the other isn't? Well, it could be that their genes confer a risk for them. And so this has been now replicated with peer victimized girls. So girls who had the 5-HTT short gene were far more likely to be depressed if they were victimized socially by other children than if they had a long gene. So it explains why you can't sort of use that kid who seems to be doing all right as the poster child of good strength, right? That they must have like stronger mental constitution. Absolutely not. You don't know what their gene profile is. I'm gonna just keep going on. And then I'll just say just quickly about DNA methylation. So now where we are with genetics is that we understand that The DNA sequence doesn't change, but the expression of that can change. And it explains why you can have identical twins and one develops breast cancer and the other doesn't. So we now know from a very robust area of research that's probably been mounting for the last 10 or 15 years that early adversity can change the expression of your genes. So recently a study looked at telomere length. So telomeres is the end of your chromosome, and it's now being used as a biomarker of longevity. A biomarker actually of stress, accumulated stress, that would predict if you're going to die early or if you're going to die later. And it's actually a very good indicator of how long you're going to live. So a recent study looking at bullied kids who were bullied between the ages of 5 and 10 and looking at whether or not there was erosion of this telomere, they found very compelling evidence for that. So kids who were bullied and had other exposures to violence had shorter telomere lengths from their telomere length at 5 to 10. Telomere length is a very strong correlate of longevity. So you think that we don't need to act today? What we're doing today and our lack of response to bullied children may affect whether or not that person's going to develop breast cancer at 25 or that person is going to die at 60. So we absolutely need to ramp up our efforts. I've long argued that you need to understand the biological underpinnings of peer relationships, and by understanding this kind of research, it helps legitimize the plight of peer abused kids. It helps explain why some kids seem to be faring well and some kids are just a mess. It encourages policymakers and practitioners to prioritize the reduction of school bullying. So what can we do? You're probably here thinking, okay, now I'm like scared for my child's well-being. How are we going to fix this? Well, first of all, we're going to have to rethink our anti-bullying programs. And there's a couple reasons why we need to. And we're going to need to really engage the bystander. We're going to have to improve our teacher training, and we're going to have to be patient because it's a little complicated. We did a review of anti-bullying programs, and what we found was that they don't work. Okay, so that's the bottom line. Most anti-bullying programs are universal programs, so every kid in the school gets it, and they typically involve increasing awareness about bullying and decreasing bullying behavior. Meta-analysis after meta-analysis after meta-analysis, and these are there in case you're interested. And by the way, if you want the slides, send me an email, and I'm happy to share them with you. Meta-analysis after meta-analysis tell us they don't work, and in some cases, our programs actually cause harm. So in some cases, we put in a program, we think it's going to work, and bullying increases. Now, why don't they work? Well, most fail to direct interventions at the social ecology that promotes and sustains bullying perpetration, such as peers and family, or the ethos of a school. So you can go into a school and see right away what it is that they value. Is the first thing you see when you walk in the school the trophy case? I grew up in a school that had a very successful hockey farm team. And so the hockey players ruled the school. You avoided that hallway, right? You avoided if you saw a mullet from the corner of your eye, you turned left and ran, okay? So, but the point is that everybody knew that that was what the culture of the school was. But you could go to another school and that's not what they value. What we value in a school is what affords kids the power that they have in order to bully others. Many programs don't address changing demographics of communities and fail to incorporate factors such as race, disability, and sexual orientation. So the Ulvaeus bullying prevention program was developed in Norway, where 95% of the population is white Norwegian and they don't move out of the country. It's very different from the demographics of Canadian schools, especially Southern Ontario schools. School-wide programs seldom include direct intervention for the perpetrator. So if it's universal, they actually don't even address the kids who are doing the bullying. And when they do address the bullies, they tend to focus on the stereotypes. So I'm going to get back to that in a second. We also have our programs focus more on physical and verbal bullying, but I said that the bulk of it is social, indirect, and relational. So we're going to need to focus on a few different types. And there's also evidence that when we do use discipline, we're using the wrong type of discipline. So for example, a study looked at 1,200 students who had a referral, so these are kids in grades kindergarten to grade 12, who were sent to the office for disciplinary referral for bullying. They tracked the disciplinary technique that was used, and they tracked whether or not these kids were seen in the office again. What they found was that detentions didn't work, in-school suspensions didn't work, out-of-school suspensions didn't work, parent contact didn't work, time in office didn't work, but parent-teacher conferences did. So parent contact would be just calling them and saying this is what happened. But drawing the parent in and having a conversation and working in partnership did work. And loss of privilege really worked. Okay, so we know that. My daughter does not have her iPad this week. She's been the model citizen for the last 3 hours. It's looking good. Yeah, I expect it's gonna last for another few hours. I said we target the wrong kid. We tend to target a stereotype. We tend to target Nelson from The Simpsons. We have a poor appreciation that all kids are capable of bullying, and if we can't acknowledge it, we can't change it. So my work has focused on this, my early work focused on this. So we did a study where we had kids nominate who's popular, who's pretty, who's a bully, who gets left out of things. And we created groups based on extreme scores. So we created a group that was really high on bullying nominations and really high on power nominations. And then we created another group, or we tried to create another group, where the kid was really high on bullying nominations but not high on power. And what you see is 90% of kids who bullied other were high on power. So it's almost an anomaly to be a bully and not have power. Remember I said bullying is a systematic abuse of power. When you compare these two groups, the high power versus the low power bullies, what you see is the high power bullies are highly physically aggressive, they're high on relational aggression, and look at that, they're the highest on popularity. They're the most popular kids in your school. They're also controversial. Some kids like them, some kids don't. The kids who don't like them are the ones that are getting picked on. The ones who like them are the ones that are their henchmen and the people that are following them, right? They're also perceived as being very attractive. They're a bit higher on wealth. They're athletic. Their leadership is so high. This causes me heartache. Like the most popular kids, the leaders of your school are the ones that are the most aggressive. And in terms of academics, they're not differentiated. So in any event, we replicated this on aggression too. And what you find is that if you're cute, you can get away from with murder in high school. And if you're not, then the peer group doesn't like you. So we're targeting the kids who are high in externalizing, everybody knows them, and we're ignoring the kid that actually has a lot of social skills but is quite rude. We also need to increase supervision. And this is actually, I think, the #1 thing we can do. Bullying doesn't happen when there are adults present. If the adults are present and paying attention, let me say. So it doesn't actually happen in classrooms. It happens where there's low supervision. So we did a very large study with over 10,000 kids in the Hamilton Wentworth District School Board, and we asked them where they get bullied. And it happens in elementary school in the playgrounds, in the hallways for high school, in the cafeteria for high school, and outside recess. So what do these places have in common? There's no adults, right? Then we did a qualitative study where we actually asked 5th to 8th graders, what are your prevention and intervention recommendations? What can we do to reduce bullying? And they said, increase supervision. There's this really interesting study where they looked at bullying and they were really curious about why this one place had low bullying rates. Turns out that there was a senior complex across the school, and the little old ladies would sit on the bench and have their coffee. They couldn't even see across the street, but the kids had this perception that these old grannies were watching them, so they behaved. So increased supervision is the way to go. We also need to engage the bystander. We know that people play a variety of roles. Sometimes they support the bully. Sometimes they defend the victim. Sometimes they are just they are passive supporters. There's this huge bullying circle, and all of the feedback that the people get is important. But the most important thing feedback they get is that they're supported and that somebody's going to help them out and get help for them. It's absolutely difficult to eliminate what works. Bullying is reinforced 54% of the time by peers who are passively watching. So these are observation studies from Toronto. 21% of the time, kids are actively modeling the behavior of kids who are bullying. We see that adults rarely intervene. In the observation studies that were done by Deb Pepler and Wendy Craig, only 4% of the time did adults intervene. And most of the time they don't intervene because they think kids are just fooling around. And what do you think happens when you say, hey, are you okay? Are you getting bullied? What is the kid gonna say? No, because they're embarrassed. And they absolutely know they're gonna get it worse if they say something. The other thing too is they see that bullies are seldom punished, and so their behavior goes unimpeded, and that further devastates their victim. We also know from observation studies that peers are present in over 85% of bullying incidents, and yet peers only intervene 11% of the time, although in another study, a quarter of the time they intervene. So what happens? Well, when peers see regular hostile exchanges without sanctions, they're exposed to examples of aggression that works. They see powerful individuals reinforced, they see the aggressor is rarely admonished by the peer group and rarely caught by adults. But when bystanders intervene, bullying stops and almost stops immediately. And the reason being is that we are wired to belong. We have a fundamental human right to be spared from oppression and humiliation, and we have a fundamental need to belong. We absolutely want to belong. And so if we think the peer group is not accepting our behavior, we quickly adjust and we fix it. We need it to be cool to care, right? We need kids to stand up, but we first need adults to stand up. We absolutely need the adults there. There's a peer mediation program that was developed by Leslie Cunningham and Chuck Cunningham. Leslie Cunningham is in charge of the Safe School portfolio for the Hamilton Wentworth District School Board. It actually is the one program that has the most promising approach to the reduction of bullying. It involves all students. It engages students in pro-social behavior. It teaches them conflict resolution skills. It increases playground supervision, which I told you is important, and importantly, it's evidence-based. So the research supports it. And I have to tell you my funny story about peer mediation. We had a really big conference in Hamilton, and we had a display for the attendees on peer mediation. So we had 4 grade 5 boys that had the outfit on for peer mediation. So they had their clipboard, they had their vest. It was brilliant. And so I asked them, is it the case that you have to be incredibly handsome to be a peer mediator? And one of the guys said, no ma'am, even ugly kids can be peer mediators. Oh, come on, that's more than a little chuckle, that's good. So it includes everybody. This is a good program. And the other thing we need to do is increase teacher training. So my doctoral student found that she asked a bunch of teachers, so this is a qualitative study, and she asked hundreds of teachers, why would you intervene? Like, when would you intervene on behalf of a kid who is being bullied? And the number one reason a teacher would intervene is because the student is showing distress. What's the thing that kids don't do when they're being bullied? They don't show they're distressed. They don't. They're embarrassed, right? So the one thing that's going to get teachers on board and the one thing that's going to engage them almost all of the time is the signal they're not going to receive from kids who are being bullied. So that really causes me concern. I gave a talk not too long ago at a school, and I won't name it, but I was there with the school counselor, and right in front of our eyes, a kid was being shoved into a locker. And he didn't look that distressed, but it couldn't be that pleasant either. And I asked her, are you going to do something about this? And she said they were just having fun. I said, I can't imagine if I just shoved you into the locker right now, how much fun that would be, right? I didn't get any Timbits at the end of that talk. But in any event, my point just being is that she missed the fundamental point of this, is that they do not show distress. And we tell our kids, stiff upper lip, don't let them see you sweat it. Don't let them see that you're upset. But, that distress signal also tells the person that's bullying them, unless they're a psychopath, that this hurts, that this isn't acceptable. Finally, it's complicated. Sometimes children who get bullied bully others. We know that even adults have trouble addressing bullying in the workplace. So experimental studies show over and over that conformity rules. So if it's the case that this is a very toxic environment, people will allow that to fester. I am now a professor at the University of Ottawa, so I consult all the time with the federal government. And I'll tell you, there's a lot of bullying going on. And it seems to be the case that it continues because it just seems to be the norm, right? When we do studies where we look at prevalence rates, we'll find the prevalence rate of 3% in one school and 60% in another. The 60% school has a cultural norm that allows bullying to exist. And I'll tell you this, I often have principals tell me that they don't have bullying happen in their school. And I often tell principals that they may not have a bullying issue in their school, but they have an issue with denial. Because every school on the planet has a bullying issue. There is no exception. We also tend to, and the other thing too is we know that calling out bullies carries certain risk. I told you that they tend to be the most powerful and popular kids in their school. So, calling them out is pretty tough. We can't even do it as adults with other adults, and then we ask kids to do it. It seems a little bit incredulous that we would even be asking that of them. We tend to overestimate or underestimate our ability to intervene. So we either think we can't make a difference, or we're sure that we are making a difference. I'm worried about both situations. You absolutely make a difference when you stand up for a kid who's being bullied. You absolutely do not make a difference when you think that you're the one individual who can bring a bully and a victim together in your office and have a conversation and everything's going to be okay. It is not. It's going to look okay to you, but it is not okay. It is absolutely the worst approach. The thing about people who have a lot of power is that they're held in higher esteem and they influence the group more than their less powerful peers. They're looked at more, they're validated more, and they're respected more. And this translates into a perception of approval. Kids who are bullying think that they're respected. They don't get that it's fear. And absolutely, if the distress signals aren't there, they don't get it. It perpetuates the erroneous belief that they're justified in their actions. And the way it happens is this mechanism called moral disengagement. And Albert Bandura is the one who came out with this theory. And he was interested in how it is that these atrocities could occur. Like, how is it that Syria can actually use chemical weapons against its population? How is it that the genocide, how is it that there could be that many Germans who were psychopaths and could murder that many Jewish people? How can these things happen? And what they found was that, or what he hypothesized, and that has been found to be related to bullying, and actually quite strongly, there was actually a meta-analysis that was just published just the other week showing that kids who bully others are morally disengaged. What we tend to do as human beings, because most of us are not psychopaths, is that we try to make our egregious behavior more palatable by using a variety of different cognitive strategies. So we might we'll reconstruct the immoral behavior. So we'll use moral justifications or euphemistic labels, or we'll make a comparison. So my behavior's not that bad. You should see what Sarah did. What's the euphemistic label for bullying in the house between two kids? Sibling rivalry. We say it all the time. There's sibling rivalry. No, it's bullying. We just don't call it for what it is, right? So we'll use these types of labels. It's just, it's a rite of passage. Kids will be kids. It makes you tougher. Absolutely not. We'll obscure our personal responsibility, displacement of responsibility, or we'll diffuse our responsibility. So we'll say we were just watching and we weren't actively involved, so therefore, we're not that bad. But you weren't doing anything. And if you weren't doing anything, you're part of the problem. We'll misrepresent our injurious consequences. So we'll distort the consequences. Like, she's not that hurt. She's just a drama queen. Or, bullying makes you stronger, like I hear so often. and more often than not will blame the victims. And I find it so incredulous when I hear people say that, well, she had it coming to her, or he's so annoying, it makes sense that the kids pick on him. Absolutely, there are annoying kids, but they still have a fundamental right to be spared from humiliation and oppression, right? Like, we can't allow it. We can't allow people to justify their terrible behavior. That's the mechanism. That's how it is that good kids like your kids can act like this. That's how everybody in this room is capable of bullying others. So on that note, we're going to have to stand up for others and for each other's children, and I'm going to take some questions. Sound good? Thank you.
Folks, just before we close, I just wanted to acknowledge the presence of the Director of Education in the room tonight. Paula Dawson was at another meeting earlier tonight, but she did drop by, and I wanted you to meet her, and maybe you can say hi to her on the way out. But I do think that Paula's presence here today is a sign that in Halton Catholic District School Board, we want our students to be safe. We want them to do well at school. A precondition of doing well at school is feeling safe. Mm-hmm. We've already seen, Dr. Vaillancourt has made the link between being bullied, attendance, and achievement. So I want to thank Paula for joining us tonight. Please say hi to her on the way up. And just to close the evening, I want to call on Nancy Dinolfo, one of our principals in the system, to tie things up. Thank you very much. Just so you know, folks, you've seen the videotaping equipment. We are going to make this evening available on our board website for those of you that are interested in perhaps telling your friends if they couldn't make it, that the entire video will be available through a link on our website as soon as we can put it together and get it ready, okay?
And we're going to add a laugh track for that one joke that bombed, okay? Sound good? First of all, Dr. Vaillancourt, thank you for being here on behalf of the Halton Catholic District School Board and parents and guests. Thank you for sharing your life's work with us and how important bullying is. We are embracing it, and here in Halton Catholic, I can speak to these parents and let them know there's been a committee of administrators and teachers working together this past year to do this rollout. And Dr. Vaillancourt's presentation tonight is the first rollout of our response to Bill 13. And so we know that the key to what we need to do in our schools is create that involved Catholic community, a culture that welcomes people, makes people feel safe, most importantly our children. We know we have work to do around supervision, we know we have work to do around teacher training, but we're all in this together to make a difference for all these kids. So thank you very much for sharing your work with us. We know that we all need to belong and feel that we belong, so we have to do our part to make sure that we show the care for our kids. Okay? And to you, the parents, thank you very much for coming out this evening. We were thrilled with the number of parents who actually responded and registered and said they would be here tonight. We know how busy parents are, but your presence here speaks to how important it is that we respond to what's happening in schools today around bullying. So thank you for that. And as Jack mentioned, this video will be available on our website. Please encourage other parents to watch it. On behalf of Justine O'Grady, principal here at Holy Trinity, thank you for coming. There is still coffee and Timbits outside. And so please have a coffee before you leave. And we hope you have a great night. Thank you.